Hello, my name is Tom Grimshaw. I live in Austin, Texas, where I have my company for cold fusion. It's called LENRGY, LENRGY LLC. And today I would like to give you a presentation on a project that I did with Dr. Mahadeva Srinivasan starting in 2018. I think it's certainly fair to say that Dr. Srinivasan was a research pioneer in the LENR field. And I had the opportunity to work on this project with him, which I'll describe. It was conducted, as I said, starting in 2018 and going through 2020. Srini, as he told me is his preferred nickname, was an early participant in the LENR Research Documentation Initiative. The LRDI began at ICCF 21 when I presented a poster on Dr. Storm's LENR Research Documentation Project, which turned out to be the pilot for the overall LRDI. The project with Srini was initiated at that same conference in ICCF 21 in Colorado in June of that year. Here you see a picture of Srini with Dr. Martin Fleischman. This photo was probably taken at ICCF 16 in Chennai, India in 2011. There were a number of components to the Srinivasan LENR Research Development Project, LRDP. One was the research autobiography that he provided, consisting of phases numeral 1 through Roman numeral 6. There were also 3 interviews, a documentation of his LENR publications and reports, as well as related LENR documents. And there were 2 volumes to the project report, the main report in volume 1 and copies of the publications in volume 2. Not included in the project were the experiment data and notebooks developed by Srini when he was doing his LENR research, which I will talk about again here in a moment. On the right, you see the cover page of the volume 1 report, the latest version, which was in June 2020. The autobiography of his research provided by Dr. Srinivasan was divided into 6 phases by himself. As I mentioned, the phases or the autobiography was provided to the project in text form by Srini. Shown here are the date ranges of phases 1 through 6. I'm going to talk now about each of the 6 phases. Phase 1, Srini called his pre-cold fusion era. He had a substantial research record prior to the March 23rd, 1989 announcement. Began with Bachelor of Science degrees in physics and then in technology from the University of Madras in 1955 and then in 1957. Shortly after his graduation, he was employed at the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, BARC, which I will use in the remainder of this presentation. He worked there for 40 years, from 57 until his retirement 40 years later in 1997. Subsequently, while he was employed, he received his Master of Science degree in physics from the University of Bombay in 1966. During that time, Srini made contributions in both fission and fusion research. And in 1984, he received the prestigious Doctor of Science degree in physics from Bombay University. During this time frame, he pointed out that he was responsible, along with colleagues, in developing the Trombe criticality formula. I actually have looked up that formula, And if anybody has any questions about it, please contact me during or after this workshop. Phase 2 was the time when Srini did really most of his cold fusion research, going from almost the day after the March 23rd announcement until his retirement in February of 1997. As he says in his narrative, he was in the right place at the right time. He was the head of BARC's neutron physics division, and he had several fission and fusion research projects underway at that time. Shortly after the announcement, he, with his director, Dr. Iyengar, developed the world's largest LENR research effort at the time in that 1989 to 90 timeframe. It involved 12 groups, and as I said, they were working under the overall direction of the head of BARC, Dr. Iyengar. During this research, they being BARC and led by Srini, were the first to report the branching ratio anomaly, 1,000,000 to 1 rather than 1. I'll say more about that in a few minutes. There was a change in the directorship that occurred just 2 years after the 1989 announcement. Dr. Iyengar was promoted out of the position of BARC director, and the new director who came in behind him was very unfriendly. He was 180 degrees from Dr. Iyengar in his attitude toward cold fusion. He was totally against cold fusion, and so consequently, LENR research was really discouraged. Now, because of his position at BARC and his seniority, he was able to continue his LENR research, but it was in marginalized conditions, and it took place until he retired about 6 years later. He and his director, Dr. Iyengar, edited one of the most important publications produced by BARC, which is the BARC 1500 report, shown here on the right. As I said, it was edited by Srini and the BARC director. There were 19 papers with 37 authors, all of them at BARC, as far as I know. There were 3 parts to the report, shown here: electrolytic cell experiments, deuterium gas loading experiments, and theoretical papers. So this lineup of papers in these 3 parts kind of reflects the nature of the field at that early time. We'll see that the field expanded in a subsequent effort by Srini in a few moments. Shown here is the reference for this publication. Phase 3, Srini called his silent decade after he retired in 1997. Soon after he left BARC, all the LENR research came to an end. The director, who was antagonistic toward cold fusion, was subsequently elevated to India's principal scientific advisor position, and he held that position for 20 years, which meant that there was very little opportunity for LENR research in India during that time. Nevertheless, Srini maintained his contacts in the field and continued attending the international conferences on cold fusion. Phase 4 was Srini's fresh attempts to revive research in India. Began with Srini's attending ICCF 13 in Sochi, Russia, in which he discerned or became influenced by a lot of optimism about the field at that conference. This phase began with a one-day barnstorming session that took place in 2008 called Energy Concepts of the 21st Century. Also during this phase, Dr. Srinivasan organized and led the 16th International Conference on Cold Fusion at his home base in Chennai, which took place in February 2011. It was co-sponsored with Dr. Krishnan, a very prestigious individual, the former head of the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research. The conference was included not only the conference itself, but one pre-conference and two post-conference meetings. Dr. Srinivasan also edited the ICCF 16 conference proceedings. The cover of the proceedings is shown here on the right. There were 67 papers, and here you see there are 8 topical areas. Quite a change from that 1989 report in which there were just 3 for electrolysis, gas loading, and theory. This reflects, of course, the continuing maturation over progress in the field. Phase 5 had a lot to do with Andrea Rossi's ECAT reactor and its impact on the field. The January 2011 that Rossi put on came just a few weeks before ICCF began in February of that year. Srini's interest in nickel hydrogen went way back to 1991 while he was still at BARC, and part of this was influenced by a visit that he made with Randall Mills at that time. His interest was fueled by several other events. The October 2011 1 megawatt reactor test that Rossi put on, the so-called the verification was indicated by the so-called Lugano test. Mats Lewin had published his book, The Impossible Invention, and there appeared to be a verification by Parkhomov in Russia. So during this time, Srini was very active in lobbying with Indian corporations on the belief that the success was just around the corner to get them to manufacture LENR reactors. He was, of course, deeply disappointed, as many of us were, in the outcome of the one-year test with industrial heat. In fact, here is a quote from the narrative of his autobiography. He says that information in the public domain since then does give the impression that Rossi had undertaken recourse to fraudulent means to try to cheat industrial heat during the year-long test. Very unfortunate outcome, as we know. Srini also served as the editor of a special edition or special section of the Current Science Journal of India, a special section on low energy nuclear reactions, which was edited by both Dr. Srinivasan and Andrew Mullenberg, who was living in India at the time. Shown here are the volume number 108, issue number 14, number 4, and it was published on February 25th, 2015. It contained remarkable 35 papers on cold fusion, most of them by senior figures in the LENR field at that time. Phase 6 was again another attempt to give life to cold fusion research in India with an appeal to the politicians for intervention and support. He organized a LENR session at a 2014 conference on another subject on the materials aspects of niobium tantalum alloys in particle accelerators, but he was able to get a dedicated session in that conference to LENR. Furthermore, he was able to set up a meeting with the Indian Prime Minister also in 2014, but unfortunately the Prime Minister got hung up in Parliament and was therefore a no-show for that meeting. However, later in the year, he had another meeting, Srini had another meeting, this time successful, with India's Minister for Power. And he was able to secure funding for a brainstorming session at the National Institute of Advanced Science Studies in Bangalore. And during this time frame, Srini also obtained funding or coordinated funding for the 4 LENR research groups then active in India: IIT Kanpur, of course, the sponsor for this workshop, IIT Bombay, S. Vyasa Bangalore, and BARC. Even at BARC, there was some research in Mumbai. So that is kind of a description of the autobiography in the 6 phases that Dr. Srinivasan provided to the project. The second main component was the set of interviews conducted with Chino. The first one I want to talk about was one that I did in September 2019 at ICCF 22 in Assisi, Italy. This interview covered the first 3 phases of his 6-phase career. It was recorded on my iPhone and transcribed by this online transcription service. And the transcript was extensively reviewed and edited by Srini. And it's included in the Srinivasan LENR Research Documentation Project report in volume 1. In addition to this interview, there were 2 other earlier ones that were included in the project. One by Russ George in 1994. This is a picture of Srini that was in that interview. The interview appeared in Cold Fusion magazine, the 2nd issue. And I think Srini's picture was on the front cover of that magazine for that date. Another interview took place in conjunction with the ICCF 16 that was taking place under Srini's initiative in India, an article by Marianne Macy that was published in Infinite Energy in 2011 at the time of that ICCF was taking place. ICCF 16 in India, a historic perspective. Now, there are 3 slides here with highlights of the interview that I did at ICCF 22 in Assisi. I won't labor you with all of the bullets, but there are some that are really worthwhile to point out because they're additional information than what was provided in the autobiography. And he noted that at the time of the March 1989 announcement, India was very actively engaged in a 3-stage nuclear power program, which was a fission program. And their initial interest was in the possibility of LENR as a source of neutrons, which was needed in one of the stages of the nuclear power program. So that's really where they got started and their interest began, but it branched out from there, as we'll see later on. The MARC director, as I noted, was very encouraging of LENR research, and Srini served as kind of the unofficial coordinator for all of the research that was going on at that time, including 12 teams in various divisions at MARC. The initial electrolytic work to kind of follow on the work of Fleischmann and Pons was with a device that they had in their possession, which they had purchased from Milton Roy for producing pure hydrogen. In these experiments, they did observe bursts of neutron emission, and Chino did the pioneering work on the statistical analysis of these emissions. And this was when they first observed the anomalous neutron to tritium ratio, which I mentioned previously, being a million rather than 1 as expected in hot fusion. It wasn't long though before Srini and others realized that neutron emission and tritium production was strictly what he called a sideshow, and it's useful for detection or signature of the phenomenon, but as I said, a sideshow in comparison to other signatures such as excess heat. And these last 3 bullets I mentioned previously, that it was only 2 years into the field that research was really discontinued at BARC, or really marginalized until his retirement. One of the things that Srini likes to emphasize is the fact they developed the autoradiography technique and discovered that LENR occurs in isolated spots, which he says is the result of tritium decay, tritium that's produced by the LENR reactions, and then the tritium undergoes this decay and affects the photographic emulsion. Later, they used titanium rather than palladium in several of their experiments. And as I mentioned, because of Randall Mills, they also became very interested in nickel hydrogen because of the advantage of the much lower cost of nickel and hydrogen compared to palladium and deuterium or heavy water. They initially got results they thought indicated excess heat, but with the help of Michael McCoubrey at SRI, they determined that that was really the result of recombination of hydrogen and oxygen. And this was proven during subsequent research when Srini was on assignment at SRI working with McCoubrey. They subsequently used tritium production as the signature and did confirm LENR in nickel hydrogen experiments. One of the things that Srini did was to postulate that LENR has localization in space, that is, at the nuclear active spots, and in time, consisting of bursts of neutron emissions. As I said before, BARC discontinued the research after Srini left when he retired. So that's the kind of the story on the interviews. The third major component was to discover and list and then acquire all of Dr. Srinivasan's LENR publications and reports. We found about 45 for the project, most of which were sent by Srini either by email or uploaded to Dropbox, but some were also collected from Rothwell's LENR Canner library website. The reports are listed in volume 1, and then the actual copies are included in volume 2. Volume 2 is shown here, has a very similar cover to the volume 1 report that we saw earlier, but in this case, it's in a 4-inch binder, which was required to hold all of those papers. In addition to his own papers and publications, we also identified other references to his work in the field. It was prominently mentioned in Eugene Mellow's Fire from Ice, and also in John Huizenga's Scientific Fiasco, Cold Fusion, the Scientific Fiasco of the Century. It was mentioned in both of those books. Rothwell had also sent a memo to to Srini. He really preferred Srini as his nickname for a possible interview with CNN. He also prepared an article on his research at BARC for the Russian magazine Est Idea, and I think we were able to get a copy of that article. And then there were a couple of documents that he prepared for BARC management in 1991 with their cold fusion. Of course, this was the time when there was the change in directors at BARC. And then later in 1995, he wrote Paradigm Shifts, which can drastically affect our extrapolated projections. That is, he's making comments here on the potential impact of cold fusion or LENR on energy projections for the strategy of BARC at that time. The fourth and final component of the project, the reports. I mentioned there were 2 volumes. The most recent one was volume 3 in June of 2020. The previous 2 versions actually took place, were issued or developed in late 2018. And volume 2 also was prepared in late 2018 in November. In the report, we also identified future opportunities that could be done to continue the work or expand on the work. One would be, of course, to expand the interview for the remaining phases, which were not covered at CC, phases 4 to 6. We could also interview research collaborators that were knowledgeable of the work that Srini was doing, both at BARC and elsewhere. Certainly, we could develop a more detailed research timeline of exactly what he did and what time frame. And then there was the possibility, although we never really discussed it very thoroughly, or really even at all, the possibility of obtaining his notebooks and experimental data. Unfortunately, we were not able to accomplish these, even though they were mentioned for possible future work. We did not get that work done prior to Srini's passing last August. Here are the principal accomplishments that Srini provided as part of his autobiography that he felt were the most important things. The neutron to tritium ratio anomaly, which I mentioned, the 10 to the 6 rather than 1. The statistical analysis that he did of the neutron emission, that I believe was work that he had done himself. And then the autoradiography work that he did to identify or discover the localized tritium emissions from spots where the LENR had occurred. So in summary, I think it's fair to say that Srini had a really sterling career in an essential field for the future of humankind. We know that the future of humankind depends upon finding a much better source of energy than the traditional sources of fossil energy because of the problem of global warming, and the surface effects also of fossil fuels on water supplies and so forth. As I mentioned at the start, he was a research pioneer in the field and certainly one of the earliest contributors because research got underway within a day or two after the March 23rd, 1989 announcement. As mentioned, he and his director, Dr. Iyengar, led one of the largest initial research efforts at BARC. While at BARC, this of course took place before the new director took over in 1991. He prepared, as we've seen, many publications and other documents and was responsible for a number of LENR advances in the field. Certainly, he became an international presence in the field. He was known by just about everybody who was in the field, usually on a personal basis. And I think one of the reasons that he had such a strong presence was because he was so personable and easy to work with. Certainly, I enjoyed working with him, as I'll say here in a few moments. I'd like to take a little side trip now to provide context for the project with Dr. Srinivasan under the umbrella of the LENR Research Documentation and Initiative. And here are the main points behind that initiative. LENR, as we know, was rejected by mainstream science within a year after the 1989 announcement. It became a pariah science. Few new researchers entered the field. And the long-term researchers that got interested, really most of them in the early days, in the early months or years after the announcement, now 30 years later, many of these long-term researchers are leaving the field with the consequent risk of loss of the research record, which would be a tragedy, not only for the LENR field, but for humanity, as for reasons I described earlier. Humankind is going to need a source of cheap and clean and reliable energy, and it's a whole new area of physics as well. So the objective of the initiative is to mitigate this loss or potential loss of research records. Here's an overview of how it got started with the pilot project with Dr. Storms that I mentioned earlier. He's a retiree from Los Alamos National Laboratory, received the Preparata Medal in 2005. And here's some of the details of the project itself. It was a really strong effort, and it was presented as a poster at ICCF 21. After Dr. Storms, the earliest participants were Dr. Clater and Fowler, also retirees from Los Alamos National Laboratory. Like Dr. Storms, who lives in Santa Fe, Clater and Fowler also live in northern New Mexico. Probably the next participant was Dennis Pease, formerly of Skinner, Sidney Kimmel Institute for Nuclear Renaissance at the University of Missouri. Then the project with Dr. Srinivasan, retired from BARC, as I mentioned. And then the next one after that was with Dr. David Nagel, who's currently at the George Washington University and a retiree as a senior officer from the US Navy. So the LRDI is mentioned in Infinite Energy back in March, April of 2020. Here's the title of the paper, or the article, I should say, Documenting Cold Fusion Research, Preserving a Vital Asset for Humankind. The initiative now includes 26 participants and associated projects under the umbrella. Somewhere around 40 site visits have been made. The initiative now includes 33 reports from initial draft to second draft to third draft. The project was initially performed while I was at the University of Texas at Austin. That came to an end at the end of 2009, at the end of 2019. And so throughout 2021, it's been, or since then, it's been under the umbrella of my company, LENR LLC. Of course, the project, like so many areas in society today, has been strongly affected by COVID-19, particularly the shutdown of any travel during this past year. So I'm currently making the future plans for the organization. Quick summary of the methods which we used, of course, in the Srinivasan project. We collect the information, organize it, document it, and then preserve it. The foundational approach was developed in the pilot project, and that approach has been pretty reliable for all the projects, but then each project has to be customized because every researcher is different. Usually it begins with whatever professional biography, CV or resume that the researcher may have. Each time we discover a component or an element of the component, a memo is prepared to document it. And then there are interviews of the participants that are transcribed. On-site visits are really preferable, especially for collecting materials. Then we develop the research phases or the timeline as Srini did for this project. And then we prepare the reports based on the interview transcriptions and the memos that document each component or parts of the components. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Anthropocene Institute, that is Dr. Carl Page, for supporting the LRDI for the travel expenses and some of the other expenses related to the project. I guess later we'll have the questions in the main part of the workshop. Shown here is my contact information, my phone number, email, and the link to my website. So that concludes my presentation. I would like to, first of all, thank Dr. Srinivasan postmortem for his collaboration and assistance with the project. I mean, he was really very closely involved and actually accomplished much of the work himself. I'd also like to thank, as I said, the Anthropocene Institute, and then thank you also to the gents at IIT Kanpur for putting together this workshop. So with that, I'll shut off now or close down and look forward to seeing you at the live part of the workshop. Thank you again.